Hello out there in Radioland. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast, where today we're going to do a little something a little different. I try not to get into too many topics that I would call secular because I think there are too many important things that have to be said about things that aren't secular. But this is just something that was on my brain, and I don't have a ton of notes, just sort of a couple little things jotted down and make sure I hit all the points here. America is getting ready to go back to the moon or whatever. And of course, whether or not we're going back to the moon again, sort of indicates, whether or not you think we went the first time. And if I'm honest with myself, during the course of my life, I've had a variety of opinions about the Apollo space program and about the moon program, moon landing in general. And I know it's going to cost me some, conspiracy theory street cred to say that I have doubts about a lot of things. Um, People are funny, man. People are funny, and there's, oh, you can't possibly believe that because you're an idiot, and then the other side will say, oh, you can't possibly believe that because you're an idiot, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. So on the moon landing in particular, I did a podcast called Same Team with Danny DeLeo and Jeremy Nascimento, and one of the questions that came up, we were just going through like a real quick laundry list of wacko conspiracy theories, that some of which I believe, some of which I don't. Was one of these things that came up was the moon landing, and I told him, I think on the podcast, that I wasn't sure, and so that cost me some street credits. I'm supposed to have like a firm, established opinion about this stuff. I promise you, I have done a ton of reading, a ton of research on this thing. But even having done all that research, having done all that reading, I still seesaw back and forth on this topic. I talk myself, like the title says, I talk myself in and out of it all the time when I think about it. And I'll tell you why I vacillate on these things and why I think it is an honest position to have, to not be sure. It's okay to not know sometimes. So let's start with the negative side. My primary reason for not believing that we went to the moon is because the government told me we did. And you may laugh at that, but my default position in life is that whatever the official story is, I'm going to question the official story, because so often the official story, in fact, most of the time, the official story has turned out to be just a straight up lie. And I don't know how anyone could have lived past the last 3 or 4 years in this country and not be convinced that the official story is usually a lie. Um, I mean, the same sort of people that told you that we went to the moon are the same sort of people that told you that a man can get shot in the front of the head and be from the rear, or the same sort of people that told you that this mandatory vaccine is 100% effective, and if you take this shot you won't get the disease. These are the same sort of people that told you those lies that have since turned out to be not true. They're the same sort of people that told you that we went to the moon. So my default position on anything, my gut reaction on the official story, is that the official story is a lie until it's been proven to be true. And it's very plausible to me, when you look at the moon landing in '69, that that it was okay. So you got, like I've said before, history doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so President Kennedy had said in 60 or 61 that by the end of this decade, um, man will make a trip to the moon. And so the entire, manufacturing, research, science world turned on a dime. The official story is that the entire manufacturing research world turned on a dime and began to put effort and money into this moon landing. Because obviously at the same time, the Soviets had beaten us to the rate, beaten us into space, beaten us into satellite world. They'd beaten us in so many ways, and that was used on their part as a huge propaganda tool to point at the superiority of the communist system. But consider this: I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole in the Soviet system. Of the fact that I don't hate homosexuals, I don't hate devil worshippers, but I do hate communists. Um, but consider this: so back in 57, 58, 59, whenever Sputnik was launched. Something in my brain says 57, but that sounds too early. Anyway, whatever year Sputnik was launched, there was a great concern in America that all of a sudden these godly commies were beating us at something. That we're here, we're an American, we're the leaders of the world, we're the superpower, we're the guys that, the shining beacon of light in the world, and we're being beat in the greatest technological advances of the age by a bunch of godless commies, and that's a big deal, and that's something people should have been concerned about. And that there was talk about, even back in the 50s, that the Soviets were gonna have this mobile weapons space platform that was going to be able to shoot us from space, and we would be no defense against it. And all those things are valid things to be concerned about when you have an ideological enemy that wants you dead. But something to consider is that the Soviet Union put a satellite in space, but they did not have a facility in their entire country to make toilet paper, because they literally had to put all the resources into putting this thing the size of a basketball into space, and it didn't leave room for anything else. So while they were touting their superiority at Sputnik, their people were starving, and there were people in gulags, and they could not wipe their behind without importing toilet paper from someplace else. So it wasn't the victory that everybody thought it was. It was just an example of a very focused situation where people could deploy slave labor and get a certain task done prior. But anyway, it was used as huge propaganda. You can go back and you can look at the stuff yourself, and I have the narrative that the Soviet government put out, that this proves our superiority over the capitalists and our superiority specifically over the Americans, because look what we did and they didn't do. And so the space race that started in '61 when Kennedy announced it, that is part of this story. This pressure, this I don't want to say limitless source of money, but it definitely was a priority, because we could not allow ourselves to be bested by the Russians. And that is part of the national psyche, the national mindset that was going on at the time. So with that as the backdrop, let's say, and I consider this a very real possibility, let's say that at some point between 61 and 69, they figured out that you couldn't go to the moon, at least not in 69. But they know the Russians are going to figure out a way, or they can't take the chance that the Russians figure out a way. And it doesn't matter who gets to the moon second, it only matters who gets to the moon first, right? That's the mindset. And so would it be outside the realm of possibility that we just fake a moon landing to convince the Russians that we did it? I mean, they would have to go to the moon to prove we didn't, right? They'd have to land themselves and land in the same spot we landed and poke around and then make it back with evidence that we didn't actually do it, that it was all a big hoax. So I considered that at one point in my life. I considered that was a very real possibility, that the entire thing was like a big psyop against the Russians. And I've also considered the possibility that the landing was real, but the thing that was broadcast into everybody's home was fake. And the reason I thought that was a possibility was because if this goes south and the astronauts die up there while you're broadcasting it into every home in the world, that's bad. That's the sort of PR blunder that you can never recover from. But if you were to film a successful landing and then broadcast that while the guys are doing the real landing, well, then even if something went wrong, nobody would ever know. You say, well, they would know that these astronauts died. Yeah. I don't know what the exit strategy was for that. If something goes wrong, do you fake their deaths on the way back in? I don't know what you do. But I'm sure there are people that sat around and had nothing but contingency plans for every sort of scenario that I could lay out. So I considered that. And so when we talk about how the Soviet, I said a minute ago that the Soviets, all they would have to do after we land there is go and land some people there themselves to prove that we didn't. And man, would that have been a tremendous propaganda coup if they could prove that the Americans lied about a moon landing. That would be huge. But the Soviets didn't even try to land on the moon after we did, which is really odd. And matter of fact, here we are, 60 years later, almost 50-something years later. And to this day, multiple countries have, quote unquote, gone to the moon. I think there were 6 or 7 of them. But no one has put people on the moon except the United States. It doesn't seem odd, dude. It doesn't seem like once we landed there, um, that would be the hard part. You know, like Roger Bannister, right? Roger Bannister ran the 4 minute mile. He was the first guy in history to run the 4 minute mile. And for thousands of years, people had tried to run the 4 minute mile and they couldn't for whatever reason. And so Roger Bannister does it successfully. And the very next year, like 26 people ran the 4 minute mile. And now a 4 minute mile is like the baseline. It's like, oh, if you can't run a 4 minute mile, are you even trying? So it's the same sort of thing. Once you land on the moon, once you've done the hard part, everybody that comes after you is just replicating your success. So it seemed like if we had landed on the moon, that it would be easier for somebody else to come along afterwards and do it. But here we are, literally almost 60 years later, and no one else has done it. And that's really odd to me. And that seems very, very highly unlikely. It's a pretty big gamble, though. If you're the United States and you're going to fake a moon landing, it is a pretty big gamble because you have no control over anybody else going for the rest of time. And so I thought about that for a while, and I said, well, maybe, because we do know that part of the Apollo program was there were several unmanned missions, and there were a couple of manned missions that never landed on the moon. I think there were 9 manned missions, and only 6 of them landed on the moon. If you buy the official story, but some of those other missions, what they did is they dropped off stuff on the moon, equipment and sensors and that sort of thing, as prep for future missions. Okay, so fine. So let's say you don't land people on the moon. Let's say you send unmanned missions to the moon, which seems not impossible to do, even in 1969. And you drop off this stuff on the moon. You drop off a rover, you drop off a landing module, or you drop off a return module, all that stuff. And so even if you never send people and you fake the actual landing, well, then the evidence that you've been there is in all the stuff you dropped off. And I thought about that for a while. I've thought about this a lot. So then you get, and the Russians have a very vested interest in disproving it. So the question becomes, why didn't they? And you can't say that the moon landing was faked because we had this adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union, but at the same time the Soviet Unions were in on it. That doesn't work. You're either adversaries or you're not. And I understand there's multiple levels of statehood, and I get some of that, I guess. It just seems like they're either for you or against you. And if they're against you, then they have every reason to disprove that you went there. And if they're for you, then it seems like they wouldn't bother. But they were obviously, you can go back and look at their records. They were deliberately putting efforts into getting to the moon before us. I got this book somewhere, and it talks about the Operation Paperclip, where we brought these Nazi scientists over, and we put them to work, and we flew to the moon, or we flew into space on basically German-designed V2 rockets. The V2 rocket designed by Wernher von Braun. That's how we got into space. Well, the Soviets had and Operation Paperclip was very problematic because you bring these guys over. These guys, some of whom they weren't just political Nazis. They were like Nazis, like they were monsters, and they designed the weapons that were being used to kill our people. And they designed the weapons that were being used to kill our allies. And we brought them over here because they're really good scientists, and we gave them security clearances, and we gave them cushy jobs. And some of the ones that are still alive are living comfortably on pensions provided by the U.S. taxpayer. And the whole thing's very hinky. Okay. Well, the Soviets had a similar program. They had their own group of Nazi scientists that they did, but the idea is that they would take theirs and they would not give them cushy jobs. They would work them until they were dead or work them until they were no good anymore, and then put them to work into a gulag to break big rocks into little rocks for the rest of their lives. So there's documentation on this. When the Soviet Union fell, we had access to a lot of files we didn't have before, and so an honest person that will do some honest research will find that the Soviets did have a moon launch program that was running parallel to ours, using some of the same resources and some of the same assets and a lot of technology along a lot of the same lines. So with all that going on, with the singular focus that they could muster as an authoritarian, despotic, murderous regime, it seems to me like they would have went to the moon before us, but they didn't. And it also seems like if we faked the moon landing, they would have went there after us. Even if it's 5, 6, 10 years later, they would have got there and they would have found out that we lied, but they didn't. They didn't even try. Once we went to the moon, they just stopped trying. And that's really strange to me. And that makes me suspicious of the whole thing. And then you have photographic anomalies. When you go through the Apollo pictures and the Apollo videos and all the footage that's out there, and it's all publicly available, although the originals have all been lost, which is problematic. You have the sea rock, you have the weird shadows at different angles, you have the weird lighting as Armstrong is getting out of the lunar module on Apollo 11. You have all these differences between the video that you see and the still photos that were taken while that video was running. Some of these things, some of these photographic and video anomalies, they have explanations, and some of them don't. And so, what does that prove? I don't know that it proves anything other than it doesn't have an explanation. It doesn't automatically prove we didn't go. It just proves that, hey, here's this weird thing that we don't know why it's that way. But it is grounds enough to at least be suspicious. And a man that is suspicious of the moon landing based on the photographic anomalies, I don't fault that man. I don't consider that man dumb. I don't, it's there. So then you have things like the Van Allen radiation belt. The Van Allen radiation belt is a big deal. So if you don't know what this is, so you have the magnetic field of the Earth, which originates from the poles and goes around the Earth in a magnetic field, and it because the Earth is round, you know, it has a magnetic field. That magnetic field is observable, is provable. It is not something you have to rely on any sort of official scientist to tell you about. You can do the measurements, you can do the math yourself. Okay, fine. So the Van Allen radiation belt is a series of supercharged particles that exist, and it's my understanding it is mostly the result of the interface between the Earth's magnetic field and solar wind. As the particles from the sun come towards the Earth, most of them make it to the Earth, but the magnetic field of the Earth prevents a lot of the solar radiation from getting through. Thank you, Lord, for that. And so that interface, that barrier that protects us from the deadliest part of the solar radiation, creates this layer, this belt of supercharged radiated ionized particles. And some people will tell you that the Van Allen radiation belt is no big deal, and that's true. And some people will tell you that the Van Allen radiation belt is deadly radiation that will kill a human being if he passes through it. By the way, you have to pass through it to get out of high Earth orbit. And the Van Allen belt is such a thing that we now design our satellites hardened against it. So it's a thing. But the reason I say that some people say it's no big deal and they're right, and some people say it's deadly poison and they're right, is it depends on when you go through it. Because the Van Allen radiation belt, which by the way was discovered in 1958, I believe, when we sent Explorer 1 up there, we sent it up there with a Geiger counter. We were measuring something else and we discovered that, oh my goodness, it's terribly radioactive up there. And so that started a series of studies that continued on for another, to this day. I think in 2012, they sent some probes up that are still studying it. I want to say those probes are supposed to be up there for like the next 10 or 15 years until they run out. The industry I work in, we talk a lot about rockets, we talk a lot about space flight, and a lot of this stuff is top of head knowledge because I read everything and I retain some of it, and it's just the world I work in. But my point is that the radiation belt is really hot or really cold or lukewarm, I guess, depending on a lot of things. Some of which you can't predict when you're scheduling a space launch. It is predicted. It is based on solar activity, solar flares. It's also based on the fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, which has got its own thing. So going through the radiation belt, you can't predict necessarily with 100% accuracy how hot it's going to be up there. And so you can't design your spacecraft. I mean, I guess you could design your spacecraft for the hottest part of the thing, for the hottest part of the cycle, but they didn't. They were focused on weight. They were focused. I mean, you look at the lunar module. It is a bunch of tinfoil with an exoskeleton, and it's a little terrifying when you really, you really think about it. These guys went up into space, with less protection than your average microwave burrito. So, so all that having said that, so when you go to design your spacecraft, you're looking at weight. You're not looking at radiation. When you plan your space flight, you have no idea of knowing how bad the radiation is going to be. So it's either going to be deadly poison or it's going to be no big deal. And you can't know that really ahead of time with 100% certainty. So part of my skepticism is, what are the odds that we got early, or that we got lucky 9 times? We sent people into space 9 times past the Van Allen radiation belt, and we got lucky all 9 times that none of them died and none of their equipment fried. I don't know what the odds of that are. And most of the guys that will really point out the radiation belt dilemma, they don't know either. They don't have an explanation either. I heard a guy on Art Bell years ago, and he was going through this, and so Art Bell is, I think, I think very highly of the guy, because he had the Coast to Coast show and everything, and I think Coast to Coast is still a show, but with all due respect to the people that are hosting it now, none of them have been as good at that show as Art Bell was. One of the things that, man, I'm covered. This is what happens when I don't have notes. Okay, my brain is just this big, yarn board, and here we are. But so one of the things that Art Bell would do is he asked questions. He asked tough questions. He did not softball, and people would come on his show and make ridiculous claims, and he would be cordial and nice, but he would poke them a little bit. So he's interviewing this guy who's a big, moon landing conspiracy guy, and the guy points out the Van Allen radiation belt, and Art Bell asks him, well, how hot was it? And the guy goes, I don't know. Art Bell says, then how do you know it was too hot? And the guy changed the subject. So you gotta, maybe we got lucky 9 times. Maybe it's only super hot every once in a while, and we got lucky 8, 9 times going through it. I don't know. But that also makes me skeptical that there's this thing out there that affects satellites but doesn't affect human beings that fly through it. It seems unlikely to me. And so that's why, and probably some other reasons that I didn't think of. That's why into my late 30s, early 40s, I guess, I was a devout guy who if you ask me, do you believe we went to the moon? I would say, of course not. It's ridiculous. It's all a lie. Government lies to you. All this stuff, all these anomalies, all these weird things, all this stuff, all these pieces and parts that don't line up with what you'd expect a successful space program to look like. But then you have to be, if you're honest, you have to ask yourself some key questions, okay? For example, if the Apollo 11 moon landing was a lie, then how far back does that lie go? I mean, at one point we had no space program, okay? We just didn't. Nobody had one, right? It was just a thing that people talked about. It's science fiction. But then we started to do things. We started to find out we could launch things into space. We figured out we had the math to figure out how to make something, fall towards the Earth without falling towards the Earth all the way, which is all orbit is. Orbit is you falling towards the Earth, something, and never quite hitting the ground. But we figured out how to do that. And not only did the government figure out how to do that, but private companies figured out how to do that. And if you have a cell phone now, then you have a cell phone because the math checks out, right? Okay, fine. So at that point, we were able to launch inanimate objects into space. We were able to put satellites up and keep them there. And at some point, we decided to send, we sent dogs into space. The Russians did. We sent chimps into space, and according to the Simpsons, they became super intelligent, came back, and they're the ones that run NASA now. But that's probably not true. I mean, probably not true. We sent monkeys into space. We sent dogs into space. All this stuff is well established. So if the moon landing is a lie, at what point does a lie start? For example, Jim Lovell flew Apollo 8, where they circled the moon, and a human being saw for the first time the dark side of the moon, the side of the moon that's always facing away from us. So, did he really do that? And if Apollo 8's a lie, what about Apollo 7? What about Apollo 6? What about Apollo 5? What about Gemini? At what point does this become a lie? And how do you prove that? These are questions you have to ask yourself. And you have to ask yourself, well, the fact is that thousands of people, not just the same group of thousands of people, but a roving, shifting, dynamic group of thousands of people from that design. I mean, every aspect of that spacecraft. Let's say Apollo 11 for easy math. Every aspect of Apollo 11 had to be designed by somebody, right? Had to be manufactured by somebody. Had to be tested by somebody. Are all those somebodies in on it? And if they're not, and we all know that we're not going, then how do you keep it hush about all those people? How do you keep that word from getting out? How do you keep everybody on task making something that could work but won't work? And people that aren't in that world, they don't, maybe they don't appreciate the thousands of steps that go into every part of something like that. The design, the testing, the retesting, without going into a lot, let me just say that it would be very hard to fake a space program, because there are so many people involved. And then you have the day of the launch. You have the guys that fill the tank. You have the guys that line everything up. You have the guys that bolt the astronauts in their spacesuits. You have the guys that close the door. You got the guys that drives the forklift to move it. There's thousands, and then you got people in mission control. You got thousands of people, and every aspect of mission control was designed from scratch. The communication, the people that did, the engineers that did the math on how are we going to talk to people when they're 200,000 miles away in something resembling real time, all that had to be figured out. And was all that figured out in vain? And if all that was figured out in vain, how does the math check out? And if all that was designed in vain, or if all that was designed and it really would work on paper, then did it work in reality? Because all that stuff gets tested over and over and over again. And if it got designed and the math checks out and it worked in simulation, why didn't we actually use it? Oh, because it's impossible to go to the moon. So it's impossible to go to the moon. It's impossible to go to the moon, but it's possible to design things that would work at every step of that process by highly motivated, highly educated, highly dedicated individuals who really think they're designing something to go to the moon. See how complicated it gets? Because you have thousands and thousands of people that are involved in this, and you have no whistleblowers. So a few years back, I read a book which really, really troubled me. And I think you ought to read books every once in a while that trouble you. I think you ought to read books that challenge some of your most cherished beliefs. I think it's healthy for you. I think it makes you be honest with yourself about what you believe and why you believe it. My primary reason for believing that we didn't go to the moon is whatever trench you want to throw there, is because I think the government's a bunch of liars. Okay, I mean that's a big chunk of it. That's my go-to condition, right? So this guy named Andrew Chaikin wrote a book called Man on the Moon, and it's this big 800-pound book that most people probably never make it through. But I read every single word of it. And what Andrew Chaikin did is he interviewed all these Apollo astronauts and engineers and people about the whole program. He really focused on the Apollo astronauts. And like I said, this is a humongous book. This book would probably stop a 38 slug if you held it up in front of you. But and so when you go through, and he starts from the very beginning of the Apollo program, the transition from the Mercury program to the Apollo program. He talks about the fire in the Mercury program and how that affected everybody and how that changed how they did things and how they changed the design of the spacecraft and all that stuff. I mean, he goes in. It's like it's an enormous book, and so you look at the sort of men that they put in the moon program. They weren't yes men. They weren't guys that go along to get along. These were some of the most foolhardy, daredevil, stick jockey lunatics that they could find. These were test pilots. These were the sort of guys who you could strap them to a rocket and give them a joystick from an Atari 2600 and throw them out on the downrange in the Nevada desert, and they'd love every second of it. These are the sort of guys they were. These are guys that Chuck Yeager was a little old for this by the time he got around to it, but it's the sort of guys that Chuck Yeager were. These a special breed of people, the right stuff. They say, well, part of that right stuff program is you got to be a little crazy. And so you would expect a fake space program that knew from the beginning that it was going to be faked, or knew somewhere halfway through that it was going to be faked, or knew in the last couple of years that it was going to be faked, that they would have picked a bunch of yes men. But they didn't. They picked the sort of rabble rouser guys who would daredevil test pilot types. Okay, so fine. That you got to think about that. And they took these guys who were, like I said, they were not your average sort of people, and they put them in a sort of a pool of people. And they said, okay, and I forget what the numbers are. There's like 30, 40 people in this pool, and these are the guys that are in a pool of people to go to the moon. But there's no guarantee that if you're in this pool of people that you're going to go to the moon. It's just a potential for you to go to the moon. And as they were planning, and all the stuff's laid out, the timelines laid out in this book, the guy did an amazing job of researching this thing. So the idea is that you're scheduled, we're going to have an Apollo 1. Well, who's going to be on Apollo 1? Well, it depends on who's gone through all the training by then, and who's not sick, and who's got, and there were all these factors that went into who rode on each mission. And of course, everybody wants to be on the one that lands on the moon, but everybody can't be on the one that lands on the moon. Somebody has to be on the one that circles the moon and comes back. And somebody has to be on the one that drops off the little rover. And someone's got to be, all this stuff. Someone's got to be on those things. And those are all historic things that no one else has ever done, but they're not the big enchilada. So these guys that, when you read this book and he goes through it all, you see you see the guys that are they're jockeying for position because they want to be, the big show. They want to be Armstrong. They want to be Aldrin. They want to be Michael Collins. And there's all these internal NASA politics. Why are we going there to the moon? Why are we? There's scientists that want to just pick up rocks and look at and there's other guys that want to set up weapons platforms. There's all these competing ideologies and competing agendas, and a lot of that steers what gets sent and what doesn't get sent, and what the mission parameters are, what we hope to get done in these missions. All that gets steered, and so the astronauts are right there in the middle of all that, and they're getting pulled pillar to post. And these guys are, you have a crew and you have a backup crew and you have a backup crew. And all these guys are trained as if they're going to do the thing, if they're going to be part of the big show. And that means a simulation program, which also was built from scratch with hundreds of engineers and millions of hours of effort put into it. And all that was put together and all that was disassembled. And these guys are trained in 14, 16, 18 hours a day. They don't see their family for, years. I mean, they see them, but it's a full-time life, and all that, and so you see all that internal NASA politics. You see all that stuff going on, and so you see these guys. They'll train for months and months and months. Not see their family, not see their wife, not see their kids, and train. We're going to the moon. We're going to the moon, and then they'll get bumped because of some other consideration, something outside of their control. I mean, ask the guy that didn't go on Apollo 13 about that. Jim Lovell wound up on Apollo 13 because somebody else got the measles, and you read for yourself. So when those guys got bumped, they would talk about in these interviews with Andrew Chaikin, they would talk about how mad they were about it and how irritated they were with the constantly shifting politics and all the different special interests that were fighting each other, and how they put on a brave face to the public, but inside, man, it was disappointment and it was discouragement, and it was these are ambitious men, and they're the best in their field, and what they're doing is they're getting jerked around. And I read that book, and I said, this is exactly the sort of thing you would expect if the space program was real. So what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that? So I'd mentioned the photographic anomalies, and I'm going to come back to this right now. the photographic anomalies, it gets a little murky. Okay, so here's what happened in case you didn't know. When NASA released the Apollo footage for the program, they released it in 70 or 71. They released the footage. They released all the training footage too, and they didn't differentiate. Okay, let me back up a little bit. So NASA did build a fake moon site. They had to. If you're going to train these, and everything that they did on the moon was orchestrated and timed and had been pre-planned in advance because you have to. You're landing in a place where you only have so much time, so much air, and so much fuel, and you can't just go up there and you're not just going to stroll around and look around. Now, they had a little more liberty in later moon missions because they were able to stay longer. But still, everything is, and so you have to try out the suits, you have to see how they work. And so they built a fake moon set. They've built a fake environment. And they went through all the things they were going to do on the moon. They went through them in that environment. And they filmed a lot of it. And they took pictures of a lot of it. So the fact is that some of the moon landing footage that you've seen is fake. It's training footage. So it's not that hard for me as a guy who wants to disbelieve the government anyway to go through and find fake footage that you can prove is fake footage. And that's not somebody trying to scam you or somebody trying to persuade you of something that did not happen. That is NASA being a bunch of idiots. So, like I said, some of that footage looks fake because it is. And man, that just makes it more complicated in trying to figure out what the truth is, if the truth is what you're after. So all this started because so this whole podcast today started because I had a conversation with one of my sons this morning about my own back and forth on this. And if you ask me right now, you sit me down and you say, "What do you think about this?" I have to say that I don't know. And I don't like not knowing. It bothers me that I don't know. And plus, we're going back, right? The U.S. is going back to the moon, I guess. Yeah. But when you look at if you follow this stuff at all, and you're looking at the progress that is being made towards another successful moon landing, what's really weird to me is that we are having to reinvent a lot of the technology. We're having to not like we're designing it and it's now 60 years later and we got so much better stuff. The stuff we were winding up with is like marginally better than what we went to the moon with the first time. And it's weird to me that we don't have. I understand the original stuff is in a museum someplace, and it's 60 years later, and it's dry rotted or whatever. I get you don't want to, fine, make another one. I don't care. But they're acting like they don't know how to make another one, and they're acting like they don't know what it would take to get there and get back, which is really weird because there's literally thousands of pages of documentation that we did this the first time, and it's weird to me that when you design something 60 years later, that it looks just like the thing that you had 60 years ago. And we also sent an unmanned probe to circle the moon to, among other things, do the math on what it would take to get to the moon. Well, wait a minute. Didn't we already do the math in 65 and 66 and 67 and 68 and 69? Did the moon move? Is it further away now? So all these things, man, all these things swirl around in my brain. And I mean, did the moon move? Did we lose the blueprints? What is going on? What am I not being told? Why am I not being told it? All that stuff goes and rattles around in my skull, and it makes me question everything that I'm being told all over again. I will end this on a personal note. A few years back, I'm going to say 6 years ago, we made a trip to Washington, D.C., and we went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and I stood there for 20 minutes and looked at the Spirit of St. Louis. I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. This thing is a gas can with wings. It doesn't even have a. Oh, if you ever go there and see it's hanging from the ceiling in the Smithsonian, and it doesn't even have a windshield. It's just a gas can with wings and like a door on the side. Crazy, crazy stuff. Um, the Spirit of St. Louis was not OSHA approved. Let's put it that way. So anyway, there's a spot in the Space Museum where there is an Apollo astronaut suit. And man, I stood there 4 feet away from this thing. And just, it is so cool. It's, I don't know. So I stood there and I looked at this thing and I said within myself, I want so badly for this to be real. I want to live in a world where human beings figured out a way to take the atmosphere and environment that keeps them alive and wrap it around themselves and go to a place that even a moment's exposure would kill them. I think that would be an amazing accomplishment for the human race. And as a guy who likes stuff, as an engineer, fascinated by what other people have sat down and figured out how to do. And so I stood there in front of the spacesuit and I went, I want so badly for this to be real. But the truth is, I don't know if it's real or not. You can't take a telescope and look up there and see the stuff we left behind. And I've heard all the explanations as to why that's true. And I just don't know what I think. So here's what we're going to do then. I'm going to throw this out to the general audience. This has not been a particularly spiritual topic, so we're not going to expect particularly spiritual answers. Depending on where you're seeing this at, where you're hearing this at, there may or may not be a little place where you can leave comments. Tell me what you think. Okay? All right, well, this is Michael, and this has been a very special edition, a very unusual edition of the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on the other side.